So hello everyone, we are going to take 1 minute to let everybody in and we will start the session just after. Hello everyone, welcome to today's event. Bonsoir à tous qui nous joignent depuis la France. I'm Ludivine Wolksik, the Executive Director of FACC, the French-American Chamber of Commerce of New England. Today's session is organized in partnership with the FACC of Chicago and with the support of the FACC of Atlanta and AmCham France. In the name of FACC New England and our national network, I'd like to thank again Ipsen and EY for sponsoring this series of events that will run until June. As we continue our diversity, equity and inclusion series, our event today is dedicated to creating meaningful and impactful DEI practices for global businesses. The way companies approach DEI depends on their maturity, their size and sector, but also regulations and enterprise culture. Today, we are very honored to welcome thoughtful leaders from Cisco System France, Ipsen and United Airlines based on both sides of the Atlantic. And I warmly thank them for having this conversation with us today. I'd like to address my personal thanks to Régis Mulot, who is the Chief HR Officer at Ipsen. Régis is a longtime member of FACC, and he launched the HR forum of our organizations back in 2015. I know a few of our members are attending today. Thanks, Régis, again. With no further ado, I will turn it to my colleague, Andrea Fletcher-Jett in Chicago to introduce our presenters. Thank you.
Thank you, Ludivine, and again, welcome to everybody on behalf of the FACC of Chicago. We are thrilled to have a lot of our members here, as well as members from New England, Atlanta, and AmCham Paris. Thank you all for being here. Again, to our speakers. Just a quick note of housekeeping. We're planning on a discussion that will last about 15 minutes, and then we'll leave about 10-15 minutes for Q&A at the end. Please ask your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll address them at the end. You can ask your questions throughout the event. I am going to turn it over now to our moderator, Mariam Huss, who is the managing partner and founder of Axxum Consulting. She will kick us off and introduce our speakers. Thank you again.
Thank you, Andrea. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Mariam Huss. I'm the founder and managing director of Axxum Consulting. I am based out of Chicago, although originally from France. And I'm very happy to be moderating this topic today, very important topic, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, how to create meaningful and impactful practices for global businesses and companies. So really today we'll be looking at this topic from the transatlantic lens. So looking at the US and French perspective. So let me introduce you to our panelists today. So in Chicago, we have Khady Gaye, who's an HR manager for the commercial division of United Airlines. Then we have from Paris, Helene Sancerres, who's a director of change management and coaching at Cisco Systems. And finally, but not least, Régis Mulot, who's the executive vice president and CHRO of Ipsen. So let me hand over first to our panelists who can better introduce themselves before we get started. Khady, do you want to start?
Thank you, Maryam, for this welcome, and I'm happy to be part of this conversation together with Régis and Helene. So as you mentioned, I'm currently based in Chicago. I was based in Brussels before, so happy to see the various lens on how we will talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So me in a nutshell, I'm a passionate person, I'm a positive person. I work in the HR field for more than 20 years. I'm a DEI advocate, and I'm also a storyteller. And for more information, I would just invite you to look at my profile on LinkedIn. You will have much more information. So today it's about our audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Khady. Helene?
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Helene Sancerres. I'm based in Paris, but working for Cisco in France. So very much when it was possible in the Silicon Valley. I'm in charge since more than 10 years now of change management, CSR, and all the coaching and engagement for the employees. I'm also sharing and co-sharing the CSR committee for AmCham in France. And it is at this title also that I'm here today, because we are with our members working on recommendation for companies and government around D&I. Happy to be there.
Thank you, Helene. Merci. Régis?
Hi everyone, nice to be with all of you today, and to have this opportunity to discuss with Maryam, Khady, and Helene. So Régis, I'm in charge of HR at Ipsen. Ipsen is a French listed company, but we position ourselves, and we are proud to be a global company. I'm based in Paris. But prior to joining Ipsen 3 years ago, I was based in Boston, and I've been working for more than 20 years, also for US companies, whatever it was in US, in UK, in Belgium, in Netherlands. So hopefully I can bring a little bit of my personal and company's experience of being on both sides of the Atlantic for this topic, which is super important, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Merci. Thank you, Régis. So let's dive in and start with the basics. So Khady, you've worked in Europe and in the US. So how is DEI defined between, the two continents? And in your opinion, and based on your experience, why is it important?
Thank you for that question. If I can give a brief description on diversity, equity, and inclusion. When it comes to a description, I think there are as many descriptions as you have people in the world. But for today, I think when we talk about diversity, it's really like who is at the table. The differences and the similarities that an individual has, and that is actually who you are, the DNA that you have, that you bring at the table. So who's at the table? When it comes to equity, first of all, I think we are in a world where we put labels on things, and we make a lot of confusion between equity and equality. So when it comes to equity, for me personally, it's really removing and addressing the barriers and inequalities that are existing, so that everyone has at least the opportunity to get access to eventually achieve a goal and be successful. When it comes to inclusion, and that's where I see a difference between US and France, because that's the purpose of our call today. Inclusion is really like, how do you ensure, once you have that diverse workforce, how do you ensure that the workforce feel welcomed, heard, valued, and respected? How do you interact with people from different backgrounds, different cultures? How do you communicate with people? And to give a brief example to illustrate the difference between the US and France, I remember one situation where I had to do a workshop around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in my mind, I was thinking inclusion, we have the same word inclusion in French, inclusion. But it didn't mean exactly the same for them when I was talking and conducting that workshop. So we had a whole conversation about what inclusion actually means in France, also just from a cultural background. And I think, even if it's different, from my personal experience, I would say that in France, we would rather talk about integration. How do we ensure that people can live together, vivre ensemble? Because what is important is that you respect the laws of the country you live in, and you also respect the privacy of the individual. And next to diversity, equity, and inclusion, what I also wanted to add is belonging. That's extremely important, because that's really, for me, the cherry on the cake. Because when you feel belonging to a company or the society, you no longer have to think twice on who you are, your values. You can bring your whole self at workplace.
Thank you. Thank you. Helene, so for you with Cisco system, so it's a global company, how do they define DEI here in the US versus in Paris and France? What are the differences?
Yes, so I represent a US, but a global company based in France. So it's a lot of opportunities and challenge. And I really do agree with you, Khady, that diversity and inclusion are not the same. I don't say it as well as you do, Khady, but what I say to Cisco employees is that diversity is about number, inclusion is about experience. So we are very much working on both, because we need to progress on both. I would like to share my perspective on this. In France, you don't come from the same history or background than the US, which comes from segregation when we talk about diversity and inclusion. And in France, you come from a total other background, which is human rights and fraternity. And so we see that in France, there is a willingness to be blind on those subjects. We don't want to highlight them, which is really different. It's really a different way to see things. So it's also a country of laws and of policies. And so we really need to work hand to hand with the government to improve this, because it's very important. There is a really genuine and growing awareness in France on how D&I is important, but it's important for business. That is new. It's not only done for social matters, which is great, it's also done for business. So regulation and government action have been key in kickstarting a real movement with the company. I was this morning in France interviewing the Minister of Equality of Chance and Diversity, Elisabeth Moreno, and she's launching an index on diversity, cultural and from origin. It is brand new and it didn't exist. So we are working on this. On gender, it's a bit more advanced with a law called the Copé-Zimmermann law, published in 2011, to increase the number of women in the board, which is efficient. A law measure quotas, and now it's not an issue somehow anymore. So this is mainly the cultural and way of operating a country that I see in France versus the US.
Perfect, thank you. So how about you, Régis? You've worked on both continents as well. What is your perspective? How is it defined in the US versus in France?
Well, like Khady and Helene, clearly much more interested to I would say, to discuss about the inclusion maybe than the diversity, even if diversity is required. But maybe before talking about inclusion, just would like to go back to diversity, because at least from my personal experience, there's also confusion there, or at least different ways. It doesn't mean the same thing in US and in France. Yeah. My experience, personal experience, has been that diversity has been about respecting difference. Really, that's what I've seen for the past 20, 30 years I've been working around. Versus, again, it's personal. In a French, at least in the French system, I had the feeling that diversity was more about being non-discriminatory. It was not so much about respecting the difference, it was about non-discriminatory. At the end, it's maybe the same outcome, But I think it's important for the people who are on this webinar to have this perception, either as if you're French or if you're American, just to think that maybe we don't think about exactly the same thing with the same word. But going to I would say inclusion, for me, I would like to be maybe a little bit challenge a little bit the colleagues there and the people on the webinar. Somewhere, I shouldn't say I don't care, but what I really care about and I think we should be caring about is somewhere what Khady and Helene has been talking about. It's my purpose, my objective as a CHRO is to foster an environment, a work environment where the employees, the associates can be who they are and they feel safe to innovate. Because at the end of the day, it's to your point, Helene, that there is a business, there is something behind, there's a business outcome also. Of course, we want a great environment where we're respectful, where we have differences. But at the end of the day, for me, it's about how I foster, again, I repeat, an environment where I have people, have colleagues with different background, with different experience, who feel safe to share it, to express it. But it's not just about being yourself, to be yourself. It's by being yourself and being able to share, you're going to innovate and you're going to build great products, whatever it's at Cisco, or provide a great quality of service at United, or provide a great patient support at Ipsen. And that I think quite important to have that in mind, at least from my perspective. And last thing is that I think back to what Helene said on maybe the background, the origin of, if we compare US as history and France, and we'll talk about it I think later on. You just said, Helene, that you met this morning the minister. And the title, I don't know if for all of you on the call, the title of this minister is Minister of Equality and Diversity. And equality, we'll come back to it. That's something that we will see clearly on the French side, much more than on the US side, where we'll talk about equity versus equality. So I'm sure we will talk about that later on, but it's interesting just to hear you, Helene, talking about the title of the minister.
Yes, it's true, Régis. It's equality of chances, diversity and inclusion. And it's really linked to human rights. And she's been talking a lot about this. She's coming from this background, but it's really interesting to see how it's positioned. I agree with you, Régis.
Yeah, you're right. And just I want to piggyback on what you said earlier, Helene, and you did too, Régis. The history is different. And if you're looking at the current history with what happened last year with the George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, that has always, existed. Unfortunately, Black Lives Matter existed way before what happened with George Floyd, but everything, came to corporate America, and we saw a lot of different initiatives, CEOs, executives coming out and making statements. So I'm curious to hear from your different perspective, working here in the US versus in Europe, do you think that the DEI practices and can be global? Can DEI initiatives could be global? And if not, what are the biggest differences you've seen between the US and France? So Khady, you want to start?
Yes. I don't know if we can have like a yes or no answer to that question to start with. I always use the merged word of global. Let's be global. So when you work for a US company that has like global activities, how do you ensure that you can implement the policies and procedures and the strategy locally? Because there are differences. There are differences in many layers. It starts from a legal perspective. What are you allowed to do and what are you not allowed to do? And if I pick back on your example regarding Black Lives Matter, So we have an entity in France, Roissy Charles de Gaulle. And when this whole Black Lives Matter started, a lot of actions have been taken within our organization in the US. And they wanted to, of course, replicate that throughout the organization. And, you know, if I take the example of France, but not only France, other countries in Europe, they were like, why do we need to talk about this at the workplace? So that's where you see already a difference, that the one size fits all doesn't work. We need to have that cultural intelligence awareness, but also flexibility and agility to adapt to the needs of the employee. If you talk about DEI initiatives, I think it's important to understand why you're doing it and how you will do it, and what is it that you want to address, because the issues are not exactly the same. Of course, when you talk about racism, racism is universal, but the root issue of racism is different in the US versus in other countries in Europe. The incident of George Floyd is not new for a lot of, let's say, Black African American community. It's not new for myself living in Belgium, but I remember when I moved from Brussels to Chicago in September and I was talking about it, they were like, oh, is this happening in Europe? They were thinking that it was only like a US issue, but it's not. It's just that it's represented in a different way, it's handled and managed in a different way, and we talk about it in a different way too. So global DEI practices, I would, yes and no. I think we need to be careful on what we implement, how we implement it, and make sure that we are talking to each other. But for me, the one size fits all doesn't work. So I would say we need to have global activities.
Global activities. I'll use that word as well. How about you, Helene? What have you seen? What are the biggest differences?
Yes, I mean, I've spent 25 years at Cisco, so I think I'm global myself, but I'm still figuring out what a global activity can be, because sometimes, and this is a very good example around Black Lives Matters, it fell overnight, and really we felt with real empathy for what happened. But when we were asked to immediately take actions in France, we couldn't, because in France, company cannot easily measure ethnic diversity, for example. So we were bound to take and to have ratios of people from different origins working for us, but you can't count them. So, you know, and US people were very much, you know, not understanding why we were not reacting so quickly. So, I mean, I think it's really a question of, I'm a great believer of global corporate decision, because I think on those topics and on many others, lead by example and have a corporate impulse is really essential. At a level of a country, you can push ideas, but it will never be as powerful as it is coming from down. So this is the first thing. And then you need to really work on what it means locally. So that's what we've done at Cisco. Our mission has changed. It is now to power an inclusive future for all. And we have figured out in France what it would mean for us and how it would be relevant to our employees, to our customers, and to our partners. And then we have to explicit all this around the world. So it's really a seamless discussion between global and local on those topics.
Perfect. Thank you, Helene. So I'm going to mix a question with that question for you, Régis. So first, do you think that we can have DEI initiatives, you know, being done globally, which I think we can't really, you have to adapt to the country, to your audience. And then the other part of the question I wanted to ask you is, and Helene started talking about it, but can we talk about racism in companies? What have you seen between, you know, corporate America versus now working in a French company? How is it perceived?
So, like again, Khady and Helene, the global, I think it's totally the solution. But I will answer that. I think you should have a global inclusion clearly strategy and vision, because again, it's back to what you define by inclusion. But back to what my colleague said. The policies, the programs that need to be adapted locally for all the reasons we heard, the history, regulations, the role of a company, back to Black Lives Matters. I think at least for France, and we can't apply that to all European countries, but in France, it's true that it's very rare that CEOs or companies will make statements about societal matters. It doesn't mean they don't matter as individuals, as employees, but it's very rare compared to what we're used to in the US. And also, as it mentioned about regulation and Khady, something that all of us we know on this call. You think about even if you think about EO1 report, back to basics, I would say EO1 reports in US. The EO1 reports, you are capturing information like ethnic origin. You have an equivalent of EO1 report in France. In fact, in France, it's even like for 50 employees plus versus 100, I think, in US. But it's forbidden to report that. But we are reporting on handicapped, on disability. So you have different. It's not about we care less about ethnic or racism or disability, but it's just the history. So they clearly measure differences there. But the challenge, I would like still to go back to the Black Lives Matters in George Floyd tragedy. It was quite interesting. It's interesting for an American company who didn't know, had to decide how do we talk about it in France. I can tell you for a French company, or at least French-based company, it was also an interesting question, so the reverse question. In fact, I may have some colleagues on this call. In US, of course, there has been a topic of discussion. Our CEO or president for North America has been clearly talking about it, has been exchanging with the teams, and the teams was a topic of discussion internally, and also even on like LinkedIn or this type of social media. In France, we didn't talk about it at all, but we got feedback. So that's a lesson for us. We got feedback from colleagues from US or from UK to say, how come you didn't react? So it's a lesson for us. Honestly, I don't have the answer. It's a lesson for us to say, well, usually it's not what you do. And by the way, in the local divisions, the regional division, we have been reacting, and we have been clearly show our support there. But should I? It's a big question. Should I, as a multinational company, whatever it's an American one or a French one or whatever country, how do I react? Because the perception will be different. It's not just US and France, maybe India, it's Japan. So not automatically easy answer. Me, I have an easy answer for at least, which is to say you have this global point of view. Then you have a company who has a color, French or American, so you will have a corporate approach, which will be the corporate approach of the country of origin of the company. However, locally, you will of course adapt to the circumstance. Not sure Mariam answered well to your question.
No, that's totally fine.
But that's where
If I can add on this, Mariam, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I still think that in our places and in our companies in France, we shouldn't hide around the topic, because if you look to the 2019 Eurobarometer, France is one of the EU countries where discrimination is felt the more acutely. Nearly 80% of French people believe that discrimination based on skin color, ethnic origin, or religion is widespread, compared to 60% of Europeans. So it's really something that is bothering us, because it's not just France and US where, you know, French people could have a sense of saying we are a cultural exception. We are becoming an exception inside Europe now. So I think it's really time to move on and to take this a bit taboo subject also, because it's a reality in the workplace. And now racism is in the workplace is starting to be addressed through anti-discrimination actions. So, you know, platform, punished by law, legal actions, but it's not enough, because there are not positive action taken, because there are still a lot of discrimination on CV. Resume to hire people. So I think it's really a topic we have a responsibility in France to address, and to address quite quickly, because if not, we are going through something that is not right for our country business-wise, and not right for our country social-wise.
What do you think it should take for leaders in the French companies to address it and be more, you know, involved, you know, trying to replicate what the US leaders have been doing for at least the last year? Do you think it's the, you know, the law has to be there, like politics needs to join, or maybe financial implication, or you are seeing more legal actions, and then, or really it's just, again, we were talking about culture. It's a culture exception, and this will just take time for a change.
For me, and it's just me speaking, and I speak from an American company, a global company based in France. I mean, you can't act on what you can't measure. So you need to measure. And if it has to go through quotas, it will have to go through quotas. And if it has to go through name and fame or name and shame, I mean, it's just to kickstart something. So I'm really a strong believer on the partnership between private and public sector on those topics, and step by step we can, you know, do little things but piled up, and with company adopting a global approach on inclusion, I think it can work.
If I may, I agree and disagree with Helene. So what I disagree is the name and shame. Maybe it's different. I have a slightly different point of view there. I agree that we need to take action. I fully agree with everything. I would prefer to name and congratulate, or name and celebrate, than name and shame. And again, as you have an environment, you have regulations that doesn't permit you, and it shouldn't be an excuse, but doesn't permit you to do everything you may be able to do in another country. I think what we need to really put you know, on the table is the great initiatives where it works. Because, by the way, you know, the debate of diversity and inclusion, you know, I think a lot of us on this call, we are trying hard. We are trying hard to put in place diversity programs and diversity and inclusion program for years and years and years. And whatever it's about ethnic origin, whatever it's about gender, we see progress, but quite limited progress. In fact, it's quite frustrating when we, at least when I look at the past 20, 30 years. So I think it's more by, again, showing that what Cisco is doing, or whatever other company has been doing, that we would be able to make a difference. And just like to give an example of one thing we are just initiating now at Ipsen. We have made a very clear statement at Ipsen that we want to ensure that all the shortlist of candidates are diverse. So that's very vague, and it's vague on purpose because again, you can't. The definition is not the same from a country to another one. But then we started to have this discussion, and we are just in the middle of it with the HR community, which is driving the recruitment process, to try to understand what does it mean a short list of diverse candidates. And where we are today is to say, okay, for each role that we are recruiting for, a short list of diverse is going to mean something different. For some roles, maybe the focus is going really to be about gender. My God, in these type of activities, there are really very few women in management roles. So, okay, we'll have to ensure that on the shortlist of candidates, there are women. Maybe it's going to be about ethnic origin. Sometimes it's a combination of the two. No, it's not about automatically have a quota to say, hey, my shortlist of 5 candidates must be a woman, one person from Asia, one French or whatever. But it's looking at this future role, this future person will be integrating a community. What is missing there? What, again, will make this environment different? And it's not easy to address it through regulations. It's about a lot of discussion and exchange with leaders to show them, to demonstrate to them that they are missing something, that by not having the diversity, they are missing something and they are not certainly going to have the inclusion. So that's one example, but it's quite difficult. It's quite difficult because it's very difficult to have specific rules. Now, quotas, we'll talk about it certainly later on. We have seen that quotas, well, in France, for example, it's working. We have some examples, I think on gender at least, where we have seen major progress in France on the boards, for example.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. That's perfect for the final 2 questions that I was about to ask Khady and Helene, because you started, alluding to recruiting practices. So Khady and then Helene, can you share with us some best practices or success stories with the audience as far as recruiting or groups, or make sure that you retain or have that employees feel that they belong to a company?
Yeah, if you just allow me 1 minute, I just wanted to add something to what Régis and Helene said. We were talking about quotas, we were talking about policies and procedures. I think what is also important when it comes to DEI, it's not easy. And the human being in generally is resistant to change. So we almost have to be in a situation where we unlearn and we go through a transformation, and each company will go through a certain diversity maturity level. So maybe for one company, it's ensuring that you have the frame in place, which starts with policies and procedures. And historically, when we were talking about DEI, it was about the legal aspect from a legal lens. And then from there was an evolution. So I don't think that we are in a revolution right now. We are in an evolution. And when it comes to diversity and inclusion, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So it's really making those small steps, the sustainable steps. And it's to your question around what can leaders do. It's really, acknowledging and recognizing that diversity and inclusion is a business imperative, because it brings growth, innovation. The world is not one color. The world is diverse, and we whether as a company be proactive towards it versus waiting for something to happen and have to adjust towards our customers that we serve, the commercial partners that we're working with, or the communities that we serve. So that's what I wanted to add to the earlier question. On the recruitment piece, again, I think there is this mindset that we resolve everything by recruitment diversity. And I think we need to have a holistic approach when it comes to diversity and inclusion and see the whole employee life cycle. Once you hire someone that is diverse, how do we ensure as a company that this person can has sufficient opportunities to advance within the company? Because that's where you see the gap and the issues, ensuring that you have solid programs in place in terms of development, ensuring that you're providing the right support to managers, because we're talking about unconscious bias. I do not believe that we can remove unconscious bias because we all have it, but if we can reduce it, we would probably be in a different, we can be in a different perspective. It starts with job description. What is the language that we use? How do we attract people? It starts with the systems that we are using. The panel interviewers, if you are doing things in the same way all the time, maybe, you know, it's time to pause, do an audit, and ensure that we have always those different perspectives in order to ensure that we are innovative and inclusive in all we do. You were asking about best practices. I prefer to use good practices because a best practice for me can be good for my company based on my culture and the structure of my company, but you will not be able to copy paste it to another company because the culture is different. We all have our own DNA. So when it comes to good practices, two I want to highlight here is one, whatever role you're in, no assumptions. Always ask questions. That's number one. And number two, we need as human beings to try to avoid judging people, because we are very good in judging people. So I think that's really number two. The two good practices that are, and that's regardless of the role you're in, because I believe that inclusion is everyone's responsibility. I saw a couple of comments in the chat here. Inclusion is everyone's responsibility. It's not limited to HR. It's not limited to DEI department. It's everyone's responsibility. And then the additional point I want to make here is that leaders will be held accountable. Someone needs to have that level of accountability.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Khady, on what you said. And if I may, I will share the what we have observed within the members of AmCham, so great international companies, French or US, but based in France also. And we have, we think we have made a summary of, in our point of view, what makes a successful corporate D&I policies. The first one is to, as I said, ask yourself why you are wanting to improve your inclusion and diversity. It's linked to the business, and it helps you choose your battles and define your priorities, because you can't just take everything over, and you should work step by step. And as you said, Khady, what works for you and is relevant to your context, to your activity, to your business. So that's the first thing. The second one is and it resonates with what I said around the global. You can't do something without the CEO and the leadership team totally embarked. So you need to have a clear commitment from the management at the highest level for inclusion being a success for the company. The third one, as we already said, is to have an ecosystem approach, because inclusion is for your employees with your employee resource groups, but it's also for your customers, it's for your partners, it's for manufacturing. So how you build an ecosystem approach around D&I, then and I'm sorry, Régis, we don't agree, but there is measure, because to understand and move forward, and I prefer name and fame than name and shame, but you can't walk on this path without measuring factual elements. My experience around CSR, which I lead since a number of years, is that guilt can't be a lever. We've seen it on sustainability. it doesn't work, making people feel guilty, or it's not what is going to last. So how you can measure and understand where it doesn't work to move forward, and then be humble. I mean, you need to adopt a continuous progress approach. I mean, you need to start there and then, you know, so it needs to be on a long period. It's not just an action, okay, tick in the box, inclusion, done with it. No, it's going to be, and as you really said, we couldn't imagine that the virus, the COVID virus, would bring us a type of discrimination with Asian people in France and everywhere around the world. So it's new. We need to adjust and to adapt around this. So, these are the best practices I would like to share with you. With, you know, a baseline on this is train, educate, inform. I mean, with a lot of energy, and make people accountable and companies accountable. As you said, Khady, it's everyone's responsibility, but the companies might have to be accountable on this. They can't just.
Actually, there's a question in the chat about exactly that. How are you currently holding employees accountable for equity and inclusion?
If it's a question for me, it's because we make mandatory trainings on unconscious bias, on having diverse panels for interviewing candidates, on having diverse candidates for our recruitment team. And so this is how at least we make employees accountable at our levels.
Maybe I can add a couple of examples. So on our side, yes, through the recruitment process involves a lot of people. It's not just a leader. There are multiple people first who are involved. So that's a way to have thousands of people involved in pushing for diversity and inclusion, but also in our case, you know, as part of what we call our ways of being, which are the behaviors that really we feel are the behaviors that we're expecting all the colleagues, associates to demonstrate every day. There is an important part related to diversity. So that's something that we are measuring, not the only thing we measure, but when we measure, you know, at the end of the year, the what, but and the how. As part of the how, there is a reference to diversity. So that's one way also to, I would say, to not having only leaders or whoever involved, but everyone. And of course, as Helene mentioned, through some trainings, you can increase awareness. Just would like to take 1 minute to go back to one point, just because I want to make sure people understand that I don't disagree with Helene on measurements. I just disagreed on the shame versus fame. And measurement, I totally agree. I think it's critical. If you don't have objective and measures, you're not going to go there. I'm not sure I agree with always with quota, but I agree with measurement and ambition. I think it's super important, and we have as companies ambitions, objectives that we are transparent, that we measure them, we share them. You know, as good best practice, one thing that I've seen working in these past years, which is specific to gender. Again, as Helene said, you have to choose your battle. You can't address everything immediately, so sometimes you have to pick one topic. One thing that we have seen working is, in fact, training. Not training on diversity, but access to our leadership development program. We put in place for 3 years that for, I would say, our leadership development program, we want gender balance in terms of participations. So we want 50% of men and women, 45-55, because sometimes if someone doesn't come, you drop the percentage. But by forcing to have this 50-50% of men and women participating in training, in fact, it had a very positive impact on the woman promotion. because unfortunately, like other companies, we have a pyramid where we have less women in the top roles than overall. And when we started to ensure that we had for all these programs, which are really accelerating your career, the same number of men and women. In fact, it was difficult to find women because there was not a lot of women, in the right band or the right grade. So you had to look around a little bit more. You had to be a little bit more creative to identify these colleagues with the potential, but maybe didn't have the title. And I really feel that we have increased from 33% to 42% these past 3 years, the number of women in leadership position, which is the top 200 jobs at Ipsen. And it's a combination of recruitment. So really be caring and be careful in your recruitment process. But I know a big part has been also related to the fact that we have been able to have more women benefiting from this leadership development program. And it was supported by leaders also, because leaders, it's part of our long-term incentive plan. There is some criteria. There's some KPI were related to gender diversity. So that's another way also to encourage clearly and make sure that the leaders are focused on it.
Yeah, and I wanted to add, Régis, on what you just said. I put it on the chat here. In our company, we also have like DEI goals for like senior leadership, but we encourage everyone within the company to at least have as part of their goals to select one DEI goal that they want to focus on for the year, and it will be added in their performance goals. So that's, like you say, a way to do it.
And that's new, Khady, in your company? They're starting doing this year? Adding DEI goals for every single employee? It's
for senior leadership mandatory, and for employees, they can add a DEI goal. So we created like a DEI library that they can choose from. Yes.
Okay.
Because
so thank you, Khady, for. Oh, go ahead.
I think the pandemic has really helped to do so as well. I want to be transparent here because, as I said, change doesn't happen overnight. The pandemic has helped to make some really big transformation, and performance management was one of them, where we were using the traditional weighting process, and we changed it last year, and this year we add an additional component with DEI. So pandemic can be a crisis, but also an opportunity to do things differently.
Thank you. I was about to say thank you for answering all the questions in the chat. So people in the audience, if there's any other question you would like to ask, feel free to do so. Otherwise, I just wanted to come back to the question from Adrian, because I am a firm believer that DEI culture shouldn't just sit in HR. That should be with the C-level, the C executives and across the company. So Khady, can you tell us more about your thoughts on this?
So within our company, we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion council that is led by our executive team, but everything is cascaded to the other levels. And I agree that DEI doesn't need to sit with HR or DEI department only. It's, as I mentioned earlier, it's everyone's responsibility. So it's more having like a collaborative approach. So we have like different task force that are working on specific projects, and the way that the task force is made up is that you always have sponsors, executive sponsors, to ensure that it's not only talking and brainstorming, but that we can transform that into concrete, actionable items that will be measured. So that's one way of doing it. So we have a couple of projects that are going on, which are actually the result of this collaborative approach, ensuring that you bring the right key stakeholders at the table. And when you bring someone at the table, it's not only bringing at the table, but ensuring that everyone's opinion or ideas are being heard and are being considered as well. Because if I think my example, if I'm invited in a meeting, I mean, I will only be happy if I'm able to speak and share my ideas, and that I feel that my ideas are being or will be considered. We can disagree on a lot of things, but at least it's having a seat at the table, but also being heard. That's important too.
There's one question from in the Q&A chat from Adama Kamara. So that's mostly, I would think, for Régis or Helene, but Khady, feel free to answer to it. So the question is, how can we make progress on DEI topics in France when there's no official metrics about ethnicity?
Well, if I refer to our morning call with AmCham, things are moving on. There's a diversity index that will be launched by June of this year. It's the first step. Volunteering companies will measure social and ethnic cultural diversity and inclusion among their employees. It's unprecedented in France. Huh? It never happened. So it's the first step. I am not sure that we can't measure ethnicity. The thing is how to do it, being respectful of our cultural background and everything. So now we have a minister that is really concerned by the topic, who has at least one more year to be there and who wants results. That's always a good equation to make things move. And we will at AmCham, we've provided and we've said that we will help as much as we could as global companies to make progress on this. So it's not perfect, we're quite far, but it's the first time really that I'm very optimistic on those topics now. I don't know, Régis, if you feel the same?
Yeah, just for the American audience, maybe they don't know, in France, we cannot measure ethnicity. Is it a regulation by the law or just because from a cultural perspective?
No, by law, you have different regulation, but one of them, which is in fact the Data Protection Act, doesn't permit today to collect information about ethnicity in a company. You can, in fact, there's ways to do it, but in a company, it's considered as something illegal today. So what Helene mentioned will be a very important step, because you need to have the support, you need to have an initiative from the government, not only volunteer, but who's going to somewhere protect you, that what you're doing is not illegal. So that's some good news. And I know Ipsen, I don't know yet all the details. I know we have been also contacted by the authorities to participate to this new index that they want to test. And good news, because we talk about France and US, is part also of some European initiatives. And if I'm correct, Helene, my understanding is that next year the presidents of Europe is going to be France. It's changing every 6 months, and that's one of the topics that the French government is planning to push for, which is this question about diversity and ethnics. Now, in parallel, we still need to add them. I agree with you, not easy without measurements, but there's a lot of things that we should do, and I don't say I'm doing it myself, that we can do without waiting. And campus management, campus recruitment, it's a way. There's ways where you can target without being discriminatory some different groups, and potentially integrate more diversity, ethnic diversity in your company. But it's a long journey. It's clearly going to be a long journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to be sensitive of the time. It's almost noon Central Time. So there's one question. I just want to make sure, is it okay to answer one last question to you all, or should we just conclude?
I'm good.
Okay, so that's a follow-up question from Adrian. So, oh, you did answer this question again, Khady. Merci. You want to say it out loud for everyone? His question was around, from a global standpoint, which cultural approach would you take on DEI? So if it's a French HQ who has an assimilation equality approach, then they have versus a US headquarter that has an adaptation equity approach. For example, Mexican American versus French, which approach would you take? And so Khady was saying no wrong or right answer here. It requires discussion with key stakeholders. Me too, again, it depends. That's the answer.
It's again about the purpose of inclusion, back to what we discussed. It's about building this environment where people can be at their best, and you have, there's not one answer.
Yeah.
And sorry,
right.
Mariam, I think just by habit, I thought that we should interact with people when they put comments on the chat, and the QA, that those were the questions. So that's why I was starting answering them. So
no, thank you very much. So I think we can conclude. It's noon. What time is it in France? 7
p.m.
Yeah, 7. Okay, so and 1 p.m. in Eastern time. So I just want to thank everyone, especially to our panelists, Helene, Khady, and Régis, for your time. Very, great discussion, very important topic. Thank you for being active on the chat and asking questions. And I will pass it on right now to Andrea, who will conclude